Welcome again, BIO178. In this video, we'll cover what some of the specific types of information are that you want to make sure to include in your introduction as you're writing it. So before I tell you what the purpose of an introduction is, I want you to think about what you think the purpose is. So remember, an introduction is basically the equivalent of a greeting, right? It's the first thing that your reader is going to read in your proposal. So given that, what do you think is the purpose of the introduction? I'll give you a little bit of time to think about it. Okay, so from the way I think about it, there are a couple different purposes for the introduction. The first one, like we talked about before, where we're trying to avoid the sleepy kitty, is we want to make sure that we're creating reader interest, right? And oftentimes that can be done in a talk format, for instance, by appealing to the audience's emotions. So if you watched that evolution talk I posted on our discussion board, the speaker there was talking about conservation in Channel Island song sparrows, and she used a picture of a really sad polar bear at the very beginning of her talk, to make the point and emphasize that conservation is really important for us to study, especially in this era of climate change. And the idea is really similar to how I try to structure these lectures when I'm creating them for you. When I'm writing them, I'm at the beginning of every module always trying to think of, some people call it an emotional hook, or what am I going to use to convince you that what we're talking about is going to be important, or that it's going to apply to your life. So in the context of an introduction and a proposal, what you're really trying to do is, like we said, create reader interest, but also explain to the reader why they should care about this. And an example of this from one of my own proposals that I have written, again, this is focusing on the red abalone. So I will read this. If you want to pause it and read it yourself, you can, but I'll read it for us too. So Halios frufescens, which is the red abalone, is an economically important shellfish in California. Up until 2017, the H. frufescens recreational fishing industry was valued at about $44 million per year. In 2018, fishing was prohibited due to declining populations. Red abalone also support an aquacultural industry in California that raises abalone on farms and sells these abalone to restaurants and individual consumers. If the economic value of H. frufescens is to be sustained, research is urgently needed to understand how the species will fare in a warming climate. So again, this is an example from one of my own proposals, and what I'm trying to make the case for here and why people should care is that this particular species has economic importance. So I provide numbers. In terms of the fishing industry, it was valued at $44 million per year, but that fishery has now been closed. Red abalone also support this aquaculture industry that provides revenue for California. So I'm trying to make the case that, one, this species is economically important, but two, this species is also threatened because of climate change. So it's important for us to study this type of work that I'm proposing in my proposal in order to make sure that this species is surviving and is able to continue to provide the economic revenue that it has in the past. In terms of visuals, which you wouldn't find in a written proposal per se, but just to explain it since I have it on the slide, this is a picture that I commonly use in my presentations of a very sad abalone. So abalone eat kelp. One of the reasons why their populations are declining is because they are starving. So warm water conditions affect the abalone themselves, but they also cause reductions in kelp. So in some years, they've seen up to 90% reduction in kelp cover off the California coast. If there are no kelp, that means there's no food for the abalone. So this picture is actually of an abalone trying to crawl up the stalk of a kelp to find food to eat, and there is none. So I call it the sad abalone. It's a picture I use a lot in my talks to convince people that this is an important issue that we should be studying and that we should care about. So that's one purpose of the introduction, is to create reader interest, explain to them why they should care. Another purpose is to provide background information to help the reader understand why the work you're proposing is needed. So essentially what you're trying to do is convince the reader that this knowledge gap you've identified needs to be addressed. So when I'm thinking about convincing, I think of like a little kid who's puts together a proposal to try and convince their parent that they need a puppy, right? That's totally something I would have done. Luckily, my parents liked dogs. He always had dogs. But the idea is you're giving them context and background to then convince your reader that what you are doing is important and needs to be done. And I'll provide an example of this type of information later in the video. And so the underlying theme when you're thinking about how to write and craft these introductions is really you're assuming that your reader doesn't know as much about this topic as you do. So you really can't assume that your reader already knows what has or hasn't been done. That's your job in the introduction to explicitly explain that for them. You know about this and that it's a knowledge gap because you've put in the time and effort to review the literature, etc. Maybe you've also had some coffee to help you along the way, right? So when you're writing these proposals, you need to think about yourself as the expert because you've put in the time, you've put in the work to really dig into the literature, identify what work still needs to be done. And then your job is to lay that out clearly and succinctly for your reader so your reader also understands, oh, I know what has been done. I know this is a problem that hasn't been addressed yet, so it makes sense that this person is proposing this particular experiment. And I'd also just like to mention that having been a reviewer for the NSF-GRFP for Reels, I can verify that it's definitely the case that oftentimes your reader doesn't know as much about your topic as you do. I had to review several proposals that I didn't really know what they were talking about, but if they set it up well enough in their introduction, I could at least follow along with what they were proposing. So it's really important. Okay, so those are the purposes of an introduction. When we're thinking about what types of information are within an introduction, really there's two main types. And here I'll return to my funnel analogy. When we start with providing broad context, I call that the broad types of info. And then down towards the bottom of the funnel, we get towards the more specific info. And again, in this whole process, what we're doing is setting up for that bullseye, which is our research idea and aims. So we want to start with broad information and then narrow it down to specific. So what do I mean by that? An introduction starts by presenting broad information. And when I say broad information, what I mean is what we already know about the topic. So that might include giving general background about relevant work, so summarizing existing literature. So that's what I'm showing here are these different journal covers. So when you're giving a summary of what's already known, that includes summarizing existing literature. That might involve also giving some basic info about your study system as well. So I'll write that in. Okay, so when you're starting off your intro, you want to make sure you're addressing what's already known. That can be in the form of summarizing literature or giving basic info about your study system you're focusing on in your proposal. So in my case, when I'm writing about abalone, I want to provide some general background about the abalone species itself. So this is an example, again, from one of my proposals about what is known already about this topic based on previous research that's been done. And so what I have in red here is where I'm actually citing the papers that have done this other types of work. So what we know already about this particular study organism is that, first of all, gene expression after heat stress has been studied in other abalone. And if we want to tie this into other topics we've talked about in lecture, think about how would you study gene expression? What are some ways we've talked about so far? What techniques would you need to use to investigate gene expression? So one of the ways we've talked about is qPCR. So that's what they actually did in this paper to look at gene expression after heat stress. And then the other paper that I described says that gene sequence differences potentially involved in thermal tolerance have been examined in red abalone. And in that particular paper, what they used to look at gene sequence differences, they actually used a high throughput sequencing approach. So you don't need to give that type of detail in your introduction. I'm just trying to tie it into other lecture concepts so you get repeated exposure to it. Okay, so that's one example of how when you're writing your introduction, you want to cite previous literature to give a summary of what's already known. And then the next thing you want to do in your introduction is provide specific information. And so that is what is not known yet. So this is very similar to when we talked about identifying your knowledge gap before, right? Before we talked about setting up your knowledge gap by identifying what's already been done and then specifically identifying what hasn't been done yet. So when we're providing specific information in our introduction, we want to think about what still hasn't been investigated, or what knowledge gaps exist in the field, or what still isn't known about this particular study system. So an example from one of my proposals, again, when we're focusing on what is not yet known, might say something like this. Quote, the proposed work will enhance our understanding of an additional unstudied factor, so this is new information, we don't know this yet, that could affect individual thermal resilience in sensitive early life stages of H. rufescens. Notably, this work is innovative and of economic value, providing a novel understanding of the potential microbiome mechanisms underlying thermal tolerance of an economically important species found along the California coastline. And so this example actually blends some of the things we've talked about previously. So it's definitely providing and laying out for the reader what is not known, so that it's emphasizing this is unstudied. It would provide a new novel understanding. It's also, again, making a case for why we should care by talking about and bringing up the fact that it's an economically important species. So this kind of blends those two things we talked about before, where you're wanting to make a case for why what you're doing is new and needed, and then also providing reader interest and convincing them that what you're proposing is necessary and important, in this case by appealing to the fact that there's economic value associated with this particular project.